Last week, we began taking a look at this chapter and did so getting into verse 10. And what we noticed was the entire framework of the chapter. And as it moved in from chapter 8, that there is a transition that you get to, because he has introduced from chapter 8 this problem of eating meat and this food, and that was associated with things offered to idols. It seems rather abrupt then when you get into chapter 9 and all of a sudden he's talking about his apostleship and defending himself. But the key there is, am I not free? And we looked at all the things about why he decided to bring up his apostleship is found in what follows. And he's having to make a defense of himself. We discussed that in quite a lengthy way, I think. And then he goes into three different items. He starts with, do not have the right to eat or drink. And this showed us that what he had just said in chapter 8 and verse 13, about that he would not eat or drink anything offered to idols, if that's what it took for people to go to heaven, he's going to withhold himself from that. He would not want to put a stumbling block in the way of his brother at any point that would affect his soul's salvation. So if I can, it's not a necessity, it's not something that was required, and therefore I can forego it. So now then he's going to broaden that out a little bit, as people may have had questions about him and attacks on him. And we looked at that as being one element he's bringing into as he transitions into two other questions. One he touches on only briefly, and that's the question about being married. And he makes sure to emphasize this, that don't I have the right to be married? Barnabas and I, just like the other apostles do. And that told us some things. And again, why would they attack him on that? It's the idea of somehow he's less. So he is trying to point out, it is not that I do not have the right and that somehow makes me less. It is a choice, and the choice was made for other reasons, which he had actually mentioned in other places as to why. And he's going to get to later on. If you remember chapter 7, when he talked about marriage, this was one of those things, is he talks about being as I am. He had certain circumstances in mind as to why it was not necessarily a good idea to marry. Because the circumstances would say that's not a good time or a situation to try to deal with all the things that go on. Okay? So he's then, in a way, kind of referring to that. So then the third item that he looked into, and that we're going to continue in here today, is the question of whether or not it was right for him to why did he have to work? It says, if you look down in verse 6, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? So in each one of these, the key element is right. So it's a kind of a proclamation of rights in a way, but it is being done intentionally to teach, while at the same time not being given as demands. Okay? And there's a difference. So you can have the right to do something, that does not mean it is always the right thing to do. And as a result, not to make those demands for other higher reasons if it's not required. Okay? So he goes into that, and he then gives the multiple illustrations about, just if you look at verse 7, three ideas of workers that just by the very nature of their work, everyone understands that they get to partake of their work. Whether you're talking about the one who goes to war, the one who plants a vineyard, or the one who tends a flock, they all have, by the nature of what they're doing, a right to benefit from that work directly. So then he begins in verse 8, and he says, do I say this as a mere man? So he's acknowledging that the previous statement was basically a statement from society, from just experience. Okay? That's what that argument was. But he says, I'm not going to leave it there. I'm not going to just make an argument based upon experience. So what does he do? In verse 8, he says, doesn't the law say the same thing? So then he quotes in verse 9 from Deuteronomy, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and then comments, is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partakers of his hope. Okay, so now he's made a biblical argument, going back to the law. Now that's going to be important that he's referenced the law for what's about to happen. But notice what he referred to the general experience, that this is how we understand things. You work, and from that work you get some kind of monetary benefit. So then he goes to the law, and he uses this as a principle. And the principle is, basically we would word it, even an ox, okay, God recognized even an ox has the right to get something from the work he's doing. That's essentially what he's pointing out, is that by God saying you don't muzzle that ox that treads out the grain, the lesson is, God says even an ox ought to be able to get some benefit from the work he's doing. So when he says, does God care about ox? Is that the extent? So in saying that, that is an A40 argument, he's arguing toward the greater. Man is greater than an animal. Hello. You have to actually insert that for some people. I just want to make sure we understand it. Man is greater than animals. Okay. So because of that, then it should apply to men too. So the principle is there even for animals. And the principle is, when there's work being done, there should be benefit from that work. So he then builds on that and applies it in the second part of verse 10, when he said, or all of verse 10 really. So he says, does he say it all together for our sakes? And that is, there's something more to it than just oxen, is his point. And then he says, for our sakes, no doubt it is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of that hope. So these are two examples going back to the idea of farming, plowing, threshing, basically the original, the planting and the harvesting, okay, for those unfamiliar with these things. That in each instance, the whole point is when you plant as a farmer, the idea is you're going to gain something from this. There's going to be some benefit. You're doing this work now in the hope that it's going to produce something that you can get from it. And when you do threshing at the end, the same, you take the harvest, but right there, it's not actually in a form that is beneficial. You have to put it through the process, right? Y'all ever tried to eat wheat right out of the ground? I'd say try it sometime, but I don't really recommend it. Okay? You have to do some work on that to make it where all of a sudden it becomes very beneficial. Okay? So that's what he's pointing out. That work needs to be done. There's an expectation that someone who does that should get some benefit. They ought to be able to gather up the grain that's created from that and then be able to make some bread. They ought to be able to do that, and no one thinks a thing about it. So now we continue on with that in mind, and we look at verse 11. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Okay, this is where he's been heading all along. He started with it in defending himself about the right to, does he have to be working? And so then he's making this argument. It's recognized that in every other kind of occupation, doing work, that there is a recognized right to some recompense, some form of benefit. Okay? So now he's come down and said, all of this he's been putting together applies to spiritual work too. That's what he's saying. So he specifically now is taking upon himself. If we, okay, now this would be Paul and whoever's with him at a given time, okay, we have sown spiritual things. You got to love the use of the same terminology, the farming terminology, when he says sown spiritual things. What has he accomplished by doing that, though? Just think about how he's arguing. He's saying it's still work, like a farmer does work, but it is seed of a different kind. But it's still work. Just by the use of the choice of words as he's using this. So if we've sown spiritual things, okay, how do you sow spiritual things? You teach and preach, okay? If we recognize that the idea, going back to Luke 8, that the the seed is the Word of God. Then planting that seed, okay, sowing that seed, they would have, they would toss it, they'd put it out there. And that idea is that's the same kind of work. You're putting something out there, hoping it'll take root. So he's saying, then, think about where did he start with this? His apostleship. He's already dealt with the fact that they know, and he has a right to claim them, and just because they're the result of his work. So if they're the result of his work, then they have to be able to admit that he did work. There's product there. There was some benefit that happened because he came and planted a seed. So if we've sown spiritual things for you. So now he's turning around, and who benefits from preaching and teaching? What now? Everyone? Hopefully. The whole idea, the people that take it in, right, are the ones that really benefit. But the whole idea is that he's wanting them to consider, if we have sown spiritual things for you, the first thing is to consider, what have I gained from this? And to have a serious thought about it. When the preaching and the teaching is what God wants it to be, you should be benefiting. The problem is it's hard to judge the benefit. It's because it tends to be so incremental. Have you ever been, he's in the farming kind of, I was going to say field, but that didn't seem right. Right here, y'all really aren't awake. I don't know. So, I mean, it wasn't that bad. Okay. Maybe it was. If you go out into a field and you've planted something, y'all remember when you were, I don't remember what age they did this in school. Is it first grade? Maybe even kindergarten, where you'd plant a seed. They'd put a bean in your little soil and your little, do they still do it in a styrofoam cup? I don't know. Maybe not. You put it in there, right? And then every day, y'all remember doing, you come and you go check. Because you know how plants grow, just up like that. No problem. No, it takes time. And it's so exciting the first time when they break through, they're coming up, and then after they do that, you're all excited, and then you can't tell the growth for a while yet, and yet they're growing. And then maybe you see something branch out. The point is it's, as a process, it's happening, and there's growth, but you don't notice every little bit of the growth. And therefore, if we only were to say, okay, it's only when I notice growth is there any good going on, and therefore do I provide something for the person who did this for me. That's part of the problem. He is making them go back and think now to reflect on how much they've benefited. And you're not going to be able to do this across time because memory, but you can think about different people who have influenced you spiritually. Okay? You just go back and you think, all these different people that have influenced you spiritually and in different ways. And that's going to be different for different people. But the key element he's wanting to see is that reflection, to value it. There's something that's very subtle here when he says, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Now, what's he saying there? Reap your material things. What material things should be reaped? Yeah. That's right. It's financial compensation of some kind. Okay? Okay, that's a good question as to why this is here. Because there's not a whole lot of information about this. You have to get it by implication of why he's bringing it up, number one, that he's tying it to his apostleship. The arguments that are made against him is, number one, he's some kind of apostle on the cheap, or not really an apostle. And the reasons why, because he was apostle born out of due season. He doesn't have a wife, so that would say this is evidence somehow that you're less than Peter, because Peter's married, so you're less than Peter. And he does not he did not go in taking any kind of financial compensation. Now, partly what we have to understand is the culture of this area, and really I'd say it's all of probably Greece, Macedonia, that they had going. This goes way back. Remember that Greece was the home of philosophy. And so while we're far removed from that, that was really more 4th century BC. So we're several hundred years after that. But it still continued on, meaning in that time you're talking about the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And they established their schools. But the nature of people would then go around and travel, and you basically paid for the privilege of listening to what someone had to say. Okay? Are you familiar with, usually it's in the business world, right? You want to go and you want to hear somebody speak. We heard about this week. Someone, you want to go hear someone speak. They're well known maybe for whatever reason. It could be in the business world as some leadership or economic guru. He already knows all the answers. Or could be some guy and you're going to be, not maybe politics, it depends on what it is, but these different people. And you can go hear them for a price. Right? If you've ever gone to one of I've looked at one of those kind of business leadership kind of seminars before, and they're definitely for people who are leaders in business and not for preachers, based upon the price alone. So what are you doing? You're paying to hear what they have to say. Okay, that idea and concept, you need to go back. Now, what if the difference is someone comes out and says, I know that they charge. You're used to having that. I'm not going to do that. Because what I'm having to say, it matters more to me that you hear it than I get paid to say it. Now, that would be such a different kind of idea. Now, stop and think like what someone would say. Usually it is, let's give it an old American aphorism, you get what you pay for. And therefore the idea is that because he does not charge for the privilege of listening to him preach, that somehow what he has to say is not valuable. So that little bit of tidbit information about the going way in which they approach things, I think we can see some explanation if we tie the two together as to why this would happen. You also have to go back and remember that all the way to chapter 1, that they were a divided congregation. And who is arguing that Paul was not necessarily so great? It would be, especially if you're thinking about Peter, the last time we saw Peter mentioned was back in chapter 1 of where they were divided partially over being adherents of Peter and Apollos or Paul is based upon who taught them. And so guess what could happen very easily? Well, Peter taught me. Well, I know, but Paul taught me. Yeah, but Paul's not really an apostle. Peter's really an apostle. He was there from the beginning. Paul wasn't there from the beginning. And Peter's married. He could at least convince one woman to like him, but not Paul. So you got that problem. So you need to understand kind of remember that these are young Christians coming out of a worldly culture and worldly ways of thinking, and he is now taking the approach to go back and to correct some of that. And he did this actually in chapter 4 quite a bit. The whole chapters 1 through 4 were about undoing that problem that was focused on the individual preacher. I think it's important that he waited until this point before bringing up the argument about money. He wanted to separate it from the division. And instead, he is tying it to questions of privilege and of what's a right to do, but that you don't necessarily have to take on, which means it fell better here with chapter 8 than it would have earlier. And that shows us how this chapter is intended to be understood. In chapter 8, he focused in on the way in which you should be mindful of other people and how your behavior affects other people spiritually. That was all of chapter 8. And one of the last things he says was, if it's going to affect someone negatively spiritually, I'm not going to do it ever again. I will never do that around them. So it's about foregoing a privilege or foregoing a right. So it's a perfect place then to have this section of Scripture where now he's going to go back and talk about things that were his rights that he did not take on. The first was the eating and drinking. The second was marriage. He had the right to be married? Sure. But he had hinted at that problem, again in chapter 7, of that there were reasons why he didn't. So now, having already actually addressed the first question he mentions in chapter 9, in chapter 8, having addressed the issue of marriage, that there might be situations why it's not wise to marriage, having addressed that in chapter 7, he is now going to bring up a third aspect, a third idea of something that is a right that he, though did not accept, he did not take advantage of. But he's doing it in a context now of this is his general way of operating. He does not always take advantage of things he could and demand his rights. Demanding rights might be an American thing, it is not a Christian thing. When he's talking about demanding, he's saying that there are reasons why, and each reason, I will argue if you look, was spiritual. And that's actually key on this. Why was he going to forego eating and drinking? Because of their misunderstanding, chapter 8. Why did he forego marriage? Based upon what we see in chapter 7, because of the problems that would be associated with the distraction and needed to take care for someone, and also some of the issues of the day. And he was regularly in some pretty difficult issues that would not be right. Then let's put two and two together to introduce a wife and be married to someone when you know you're going to be in prison regularly. Okay? So now what does he do? He issues the third thing of the reason why that he doesn't take money, and it's a spiritual reason. That for them in their situation, it was not the right decision to make money off them, because that would hurt them spiritually. Now that's what he's going to address here moving forward, but I hope that kind of contextualizes it all for you and gives you a broader picture of how it all fits together. So let's then look and say, okay, what have we seen then that in his argument in verse 11, when he says, is it a great thing if we reap the material things, is he not here saying that it is right and acceptable to pay a preacher? I was hoping for greater response. Okay, thank you. You're welcome, Eddie. But, okay, to recognize those things. Okay, so he's saying, now, we need to point that out, though, because there's a small number who do not accept that idea. And that in some way that would be wrong. Paul addresses that here. He also addresses it in Galatians chapter 6. Okay, so he's making this and say it is a proper thing then for someone who you're gaining from spiritually to then receive some financial, material benefit as a result of doing that. That is a perfectly proper thing to do. In other words, verse 11, yes, I have this right. So verse 12, he's going to build up on that. Go ahead, John. Yes. Supporting the work, supporting the preacher. I appreciate you saying that because it distinguishes the nature of it. He's going to do what he's going to do, which is part of the point anyway. And then the nature of support is to financially support him so he can do that. And the difference is that I think is really valid of what John is saying here, is that a preacher is, his obligation, his sense of responsibility are to God. And that he is trusting that you feel the same responsibility to God and that you would support him as a result. Rather than it being a tit-for-tat kind of, hey, I'm paying you for the right message this week. Okay, that kind of direct compensation. Even though he makes that general argument, I think that your point is valid. So he says, if others, verse 12, are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Okay. Now, does Paul think a lot of himself here? I mean, if other people get it, then surely we should. What's the relationship that he's pointing out? Okay, the spiritual is actually greater. That's the first thing. The spiritual things that are, because they are, they're dealing with, number one, things that are eternal, and there automatically means they're the value has a lasting value. If we measure things only in terms of their temporal value, okay, that is, this can give me the most right now, understand, you hearing me teach is, okay, limited, right, what it can gain. But if you look at it over the long, in terms of eternity, of first of all, how it can affect you in life, and then what the benefit can be in eternity, that all of a sudden changes the nature of how we value these things. Okay? And that's what he's trying to do in verse 11. And then when he changes over and saying that if others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? So if he's going back to say, okay, you've recognized that Peter would have this right, and Apollos would have this right, and you think, I don't have this right? Now he's back to the same point he made earlier. Who taught them originally? Who was the first one to teach them? Paul was. Paul was. The others came on afterwards, right? So if you're going to acknowledge that the ones that came afterwards have the right to some compensation, then we ought to be able to recognize that I'm the one that started all this, provided you the original gospel, made sure that you became Christians because of listening to me, and I provided you miraculous gifts, that maybe that's worth a little something, right? But you're valuing the people that came after that. So he says, so that's when he says about, are we not even more, is that they wouldn't have even been in a position to listen and know Peter and Apollos if it hadn't been for Paul. They would not be able to teach one another right now if it were for Paul. So now we come back and he's going to move off from there as you look in verse 12, the second part. Nevertheless, we have not used this right. That word's authority. We have not used this authority. So he's saying a couple of things here, first of all. Number one, he is now saying without question, a little bit subtly maybe, he has this authority. He has the authority to eat and drink those things that were offered to idols. He has the authority to be married, and he has the authority to get compensated for his work. He has authority for all of those things. But we have not used this right, not used this authority. So he has it, but he hasn't taken advantage of it to go in and to make that exchange, force that issue forward. He says, I didn't do that. Instead, now we get the explanation as to the why in terms of the motive, the second part. But endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Here's why. Here's the reason why. We have not used this right, so we've not created this exchange, but endure all things. Now this is have to check, this is a different word for endure than we a lot of times see. So when you think of the idea of endure, I think probably forbear is a little bit better here. It's the idea of putting some kind of barrier up, or in this sense, not wanting to put any kind of thing when he's dealing with other people. He'll take the extra load because he thought that might be important for the work to go forward. And that's why he says we endure things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ, or in the sense of we create some kind of hindrance. Paul believes so strongly in his work that, and you have to, again, think about this, for where they were, he does not want anyone to think that he's profiting off the gospel, that's what this is about. That's how far he's willing to go. The nature of the endure, I'm going to take one for the team here. So when you say that word endure, forbear, he says, I'm going to take one for the team on all these things. Okay, what he'd just been talking about, all these three things he had the right to do. Okay, I have the right to do it, but I'm just going to not do that because that could create problems. And I don't want to create problems. But specifically, it's the type of problems. Anything that would give or create a hindrance. Now the tough question. What creates a hindrance, or let's broaden it, could create a hindrance that would, to someone listening to the gospel of Christ? Paco? Mm-hmm. Correct. He's definitely wanting to pull back, and he does not want people to say he's doing it for the money. And Corinth was a big financial center. It was a wealthy place. And he does not want to be simply understood and letting Corinth provide the context of the gospel. He wanted the Apostle Paul to determine the context of the gospel. And this is what we find, if you remember, in the book of Philippians. We find that the Philippians, Paul's writing this later than Corinth, the letters to the Corinthians. He's writing to the Philippians probably around 62 AD, so 7 years later than this. But he talks about how they had been partakers of the gospel from the first. Corinth was a wealthy situation. We find especially when we later on we see it, but in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, we find that they were a wealthier group of people, congregation. Philippi, not so much. We find, though, that Philippi, which was in Macedonia, they were one of the last places Paul was before going to Corinth. Okay, that's where you get Berea, Thessalonica, and Philippi. We're all up there in that area. Remember, he came first to Philippi, and then, so from them, they start helping him. Thessalonica, we see a similar kind of discussion in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 12, in which Paul is also not taking money. That's right. He uses that as a foundation. So it puts him, the point is that it put him in a much better position to tell them what they needed to hear. That's not going to be true every place. But in that particular culture, Paul thought it was really important because of their attitude toward money and the connection with teaching. and the work issues that some of them had, that he be an example of work that they could understand as work, and that he would get them to value the gospel for its own sake, and not try to value it based upon or be hindered from it because they had to pay him or provide for him to do that. So he's taking those things away. So he's saying, I'm forbearing. I'm just not going to require that of you. He's saying he could. He could. He had to have the right to get up and say, y'all been freeloading long enough. Come on, it's time y'all help out a little bit. But these people, they had a bigger problem with it. Philippi, just north of there, they didn't even think a thing about it. Now, they obeyed the gospel. You think about the origin of that congregation was Lydia and then the Philippian jailer. They came at it from the circumstances that created that congregation. There was no question about the motive involved when you think about the background. Whereas when you go to Thessalonica and to Corinth, Paul's walking in as a free man. And they're big. You're dealing with the Jews in Thessalonica, and he's dealing. It's a harder time in Corinth. But that's kind of the difference in the culture. What does this say, though, generally about what must be our mindset? And it's fine if you want. This is a preacher passage, so if I'm going to say that he's talking about it is right and correct to support a preacher financially, then at the same time, it is correct that as preachers, there are times where something may be your right by God, that you do not push that right because you're afraid of it creating the wrong kind of hurting ultimately people's belief of the gospel. So, y'all have any examples today of where that might be the case? I'll tell you this, it is easy when I get to talk about mission work. It would be very easy to do that. Because if you're going to do long-term mission work especially, you don't go over there, or my view of it, having done just a little bit, you don't want to go in being the wealthy American. Because I'll tell you, people tend to start with that anyway, and thinking that money grows on trees here. And so it's just, they don't even, for you, they just think that you're just an endless supply in many places. So you have to go in and dissuade them of that notion a lot of times, of saying, we're not helping people, we're not doing that kind of thing. I'm here to help you right where you are spiritually. You have to do certain things, and guys that don't know enough about it and haven't done their homework can end up creating a problem because they end up creating financial incentives for the gospel. We do go in to go and do good, and you're giving stuff away, and everyone comes to the giveaway, and all they have to do is be baptized at the giveaway, so there we go. No one's baptized. No, seriously, that happens. You've got to know the culture well enough to understand what your actions look like to those who are there. Otherwise, you're not going to actually have the effect you think you're having. That's why we shouldn't just judge it based upon how many people we can get underwater. It's about how many lives are being changed and going to heaven. That's the work. Now, like I said, I can see that very easily in different places overseas. Are there those situations where that could be the same here? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, yes. And notice the examples of starting a congregation from scratch which I watched my dad do, and in trying to fit into that culture and make sure that there wasn't any kind of issue. Especially in that case, we were in, y'all got the hard thing, but rural North Carolina back in the 70s. I knew you'd get the reference. Okay, but it was, I mean, you know, it was the place where when we got there, we had to go in and find the congregation. He found a place that was deeded in perpetuity to the church that some Pentecostals had come in and taken over, and he went in and ran them out. Okay, but he did. He had the law on his side. Had to put in running water. This was in 74. All right, everybody, all you youngins. So you go in and you're going to have to change what you do. You go overseas, some people are going to look at you and say, well, you can't just be you try to fit in there. Okay, he's about to get to this, so we'll definitely have that conversation more moving forward. But that's a good start to it. We'll pick up in verse 13 next week.